Never had my theme music before. So this is a pretty cool talk that I was able to give with my my long-term friend and mentor, Dave Thomas. He's the guy responsible for the Pragmatic bookshelf. They're bringing to you the cool Elixir books lately. Dave wasn't able to be here. He has a kid that's graduating, but he sends his regards. And you're getting the worst half of this talk, and there will be long periods of silence when Dave should be speaking. I want to say first, take a second to take a deep breath and look around. This is an incredible time. This is a time when a new language is being launched. You're in on the ground floor. My daughter and I got to go by the Empire State Building yesterday, so we were thinking about things like foundations, and this is the ground floor. This is happening right now. This is exploding around us. A couple of years ago, we had the very first Elixir Conference that had fewer people than the people in this room for the first New York Elixir Conference. So give yourselves a hand. I want to take a little bit of time to tell my story, and it's not because I'm special, but because I was involved in the early moments of Elixir. So this is really our story. I have the pleasure, this is the first time my daughter's heard me speak before, and I think that's important because she gets to see who she is and where she came from. And I think that we have an opportunity to do very much the same thing today. We get to see where Elixir came from, and we get to tell our story. And this is the first time that many of you have heard it, maybe more for some of you. But for those of you who go to conferences related to language, these things become part of your DNA, and these become, these things make the language bigger than just a community or just a person. It's a really cool opportunity, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. So I want to take you back to my first computer. This baby was tricked out. 4 kilobytes, not megabytes, not gigabytes, 4 kilobytes of memory. That meant that I could have about 2 pages of a word processor document in it if you take away the word processor itself, which really was no more than just a text editor with word wrap, which we were really excited about. You could fit 32 characters across the screen and about 16 vertically. And when this thing ran out of memory, as things grew, with my dad, I sat down and we put in a 16K chip, right? But that wasn't enough. We wanted more. And there was only one socket, so we piggybacked another chip. We had our soldering iron, and we broke off the pin, and we were really terrified to do this because there was no internet, and we were kind of following these chip specifications that I knew nothing about. But we broke off the pin and added the memory, and everything worked. And from that moment on, I was hooked. Most people were mowing lawns or babysitting to make spending money, and I was writing games. Kind of sad, sadistic games, but games nonetheless. And that didn't pay a lot, maybe 50 bucks, 100 bucks at a shot. It was a lot of money to me back then, and it was a lot of fun. And I learned trigonometry, and I learned what a byte was, and how to turn on and off individual bits in the byte to light picture elements of the screen. And it was a good time. And it got better in high school. A lot of people at the time were lucky to have an after-school program with a little bit of computer science, and you got to write a basic program or something. There was a man named Mr. Watkins that laid his hands on about 8 TRS-80 Model 2 computers, Radio Shack, and these babies did everything. They even had disk drives, so I didn't have to use my crazy color take and tape recorder to save things. And we learned together over 3 years of computer science because of one man's dedication. This probably isn't a great thing to say at a conference like this. It's certainly not a macho thing to say, but I love BASIC. There's something wise about it. Applause even. Oh man, I really feel welcome now. But this is something where usually you say, my brother likes BASIC, right? But I really did. You know, when a program broke, it broke in the context. It was like an inline debugger, right? It would break right in context there, and you can kind of check out variables. And I thought it was a wise language, and I really loved it. All good things have to come to an end, and high school did. And I went to school at Mississippi State for my undergraduate degree and University of Texas for my master's work. And in college, I used mostly Pascal, but some C and some Lisp. And I got to tell you, I really liked Pascal too. It was a language that was probably a little less powerful than some of the things that we're used to. But it was a language where, you know, this is a jazz place, and jazz is good or bad, not necessarily based on the notes you play, but sometimes on the notes that you don't play, on the air that's in the language. And Pascal left out something from BASIC, the go-to, to teach structured programming, and it did it very, very well. It had this great way of showing you what input was and what output was, and building interfaces that worked in one way and that were more structured than the people that were coming in from Fortran or COBOL or things like that. So in college, the IBM personal computer came out, this beautiful thing that, you know, it was a cool thing because this was a proprietary company, very much a proprietary company. And they put together this marvelous open platform with off-the-shelf components. And so, you know, we all saw these come out. And in college, I couldn't afford one, so I bought a clone. This was a PC's Limited 1000, plain vanilla, right? And this was a great machine to me, and it kind of took me beyond college and into my professional career. And in fact, I became infatuated with IBM, and I worked for them for a number of years. And at IBM, I worked in C and C++ and Java. And you know I tolerated Java. In fact, I had a love-hate relationship with Java. So over a number of years, I did a lot of things at IBM. I built language interfaces. I did database design. IBM is a great, great company to work for, and they were certainly good for me. And they helped my family kind of establish ourselves, and you know, they let me have a life while I was coding for them, and I was always grateful for that. And I really learned to program, but I got to tell you, I just had this love-hate relationship with Java back then. I wasn't used to typing public, static, void, anything to, you know, to print your name or hello world or whatever you're supposed to print. And so eventually I left IBM. I took a solo career. And you can tell that my love-hate relationship with Java remained by my first 2 books. Right? So the one on your left is bitter Java, and that's not what you think it is. A lot of people were starting to develop a frustration with Java. And, you know, I had some of that, but that's not what this book was about. This book was about learning from anti-patterns. You look at a lot of broken code, and you get better as a programmer. But everybody saw this, and they saw, oh, bitter Java, finally, the king is dead, you know. And so I got slash-dotted, right? And so, you know, so right after my IBM career, I joined a startup. The startup immediately blew up. I mean, like 3 months after I joined it, and so I'm unemployed, and I'm in Austin, Texas, and I call IBM to go back, and they said, oh, nope, nothing for you here, you know. And so I applied everywhere, and you know, all these startups were blowing up, so there were all these talented developers out there, so I guess I'll write books, right? And so I wrote this book, and it had this title, Bitter, and people saw Bitter and Java together, and I got slash-dotted, but they assumed that somebody was finally writing about what was wrong with Java, right? So to give you an idea of the frustration that was out there at the time, we loaded the Amazon page for the book, and there was a rank there, a sales rank, And it was 100,000 of like 4 million books or something on Amazon at the time. And, my family and I would, click reload, right? And then it kind of comes up from 4 million to 2 million. All right, somebody bought another book, right? And then we hit reload, and it kind of came up to 30,000. And my publisher said, congratulations, you have a moderately successful book, right? And he spoke too soon, because that's about when the server side happened. So they talked about, I knew the creator of the server side, which was a famous Java site. And Slashdot found it, and then it really took off. So we hit reload, and it went up to 300, or number one in a lot of the programming books. And we hit reload. We kept doing this until finally I was, for 1 hour, I was between Hawkins and Grisham, right? 6 and 8. Or no, like 8 and 10 or something like that. I was number 7 or number 9 on Amazon or something like that. It was a really cool moment. But I stepped back to think later, very much later, that this was really a terrible book, right? And there were a lot of disappointed, really surprised people, and it didn't have great reviews because it was a terrible book, but it kind of got me an introduction as a speaker. And so I started to learn what it was that people liked about Java and what they didn't like. And so probably the highlight of my Java career was the Better, Faster, Lighter book, and that was a way to do lightweight development in Java, which was really important because Java had things like POJOs, plain, ordinary Java object, right? A 4-letter acronym for something that you should be using anyway, right? So anyway, I was starting to get full of myself and very arrogant. I'm a good marketer. I wasn't a great programmer. I certainly wasn't a great writer. And there was a guy named Dave Thomas who owned a rival publishing company that was much smaller than my O'Reilly publishing company that I, had a lot of loyalty with. And we shared a train ride in Atlanta. This was the MARTA train, back to the airport. And Dave was telling me about a language called Ruby. And I didn't like what I heard because it sounded a lot like the languages that I used to like. And so I started to get really frustrated and belligerent in the conversation. And I'd say, certainly Ruby can't do this, and it can't do this, and it can't do this. And for those of you who have met Dave, he's the most polite person you would ever meet. And terrified of making any kind of controversial statement or anything that was remotely impolite. And this is the first and only time that I've ever heard Dave snap, right? So this is the quote that changed the trajectory of my career. Right? Shut up. Shut up, Bruce, and do something non-trivial, and then you're allowed to have a conversation with me again. And I said, okay. And so then I kind of brooded all the way back to the airport, and I went home, and we wrote a Ruby application. And I learned it and wrote the application in about a day and a half. And it was for a client that we'd just bid a 7-day project for, so that was kind of embarrassing. And it was fast enough, certainly not blindingly fast, and it was a beautiful language. And I came to realize that this was going to change a lot more than just this particular venture. So I'd like to tell Dave that he wrecked my Java programming career, and he's very proud of that. And I wrote this From Java to Ruby book because I didn't think that managers in the United States would buy Ruby. So I wanted to tell them why other people were doing it. Nobody was doing it, right? So I found the 2 or 3 people who were, and by the time the book was published, Ruby had already taken off. And I didn't know at the time, but Dave was really the reason that the language was taking off, right? There are a lot of people who write great languages and are very nice guys. And those languages are mostly wallowing in obscurity. And Dave had a great eye. So he wrote this book called the Pickaxe Book to establish Ruby as an effective and viable alternative language in the United States. And he did exactly that. I mean, think about that. a language that nobody had heard of, nobody had used, nobody cared about. He saw it, saw the opportunity. He knew, I'm not a great language man, but this is beautiful, and I'm going to promote it, and I'm going to make this succeed. And he put that language on its back, and it did succeed. So the next book on the list is not one of mine, but one that Dave read, and frankly, I hadn't read it at the time. It's a book called The Timeless Way of Building. It's not even about programming. It's about building buildings, right? And this book about building is by a guy named Christopher Alexander, and this is the famous quote from the book. I'll let you read it. Has anybody seen that quote before or heard of it? Show of hands for people familiar with this. So this was a meme kind of going on in the open source and Ruby communities for a while. Dave and I are old enough that we could recycle this. But Dave had an eye for this with programming languages, right? They called it quality without a name, or QUAN. Now that's a 4-letter acronym that I can get behind. Says Dave, I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. And he could see it in a programming language like nobody I have ever met before or since. So in Ruby, QUAN meant something different than we'd seen before. People were used to talking about programming languages in terms of types and specifications and performance and features. And Dave was using language like love and passion. And it was radically different than what we'd seen before. So in Ruby, QUAN came in the form of metaprogramming that you could open up a class and do exactly what you wanted to with the class, and it would introduce new language, new features of your program in terms of instance variables and methods as you opened up the class. So you could do things like inject code in your method definition, or in the definition itself, not in the body of the method. And you could do all kinds of things that were really strange and interesting at the time, and really defined the way that we thought about programming, especially in the Ruby on Rails language. And there was all of this ceremony around dealing with types in the wrong way in the Java programming language and the C programming language, and we kept on building on top of this ugly, twisted foundation. And Ruby said, you don't have to do all that stuff, right? It's really, it's the way that Java is doing it is not clean, it's not safe, it's not helpful. Let's dispense with it. And your aesthetics may vary for a whole generation of developers. How many of you have come from a Ruby background? Just, that's probably not an accident, right? Jose is a Ruby guy. Dave is a Ruby guy. A lot of the people who have been launching this language have come from this kind of background. Don't turn your back on what you love, right? So Ruby was a very good language for a long time, and we can embrace it. And we don't have to stoop to trashing this programming language because it did some wonderful things. It had a lot of QUAN. So anyway, all good things must come to an end, right? Ruby maybe has not come to an end yet, but we can all see that some of the best Ruby developers have left the room. And we can all see why. That processor designs are changing, that language design is changing, and it's starting to catch up, and it's starting to radically change the way that we think about programming. We know the damage of mutability now when it comes to building concurrent systems. And building concurrent systems is becoming much more important. So when Dave said to do something non-trivial, shut up and do something non-trivial, that seed sat in my mind for a long, long time. And eventually, when I was uncomfortable with Ruby, I saw that seed sprouted. And I said, hey, I can do that not just one time, but 7 times. And when I come out of the experience, I'll know more about the programming world, right? So this was really my first foray into really understanding what was beyond the borders of the Java programming language, right? And beyond the Ruby programming language, and moving into different, not just programming languages, but different programming paradigms. This was a story to me about what was happening with functional programming languages. Now, what's interesting is that when you make little decisions like this, like, oh gosh, I'm scared, I think I'll chronicle the experience, I'll write about the experience, and nobody's going to care, but I'll just kind of throw it out there. The world can change when you're public and vulnerable with things like this, right? Look at these 3 languages. For those of you not familiar with them, the Ruby language on the top there is the foundation for the syntax in Elixir. The 5th language down there, ERLANG, is the virtual machine for Elixir. Clojure, the 6th language down, is the meta-programming model, the macro model, for the language that Elixir is built in, called Elixir, right? And that's not an accident, because somebody was reading about my stumblings in learning programming languages, somebody from the Ruby community. And I started stalking this guy, this Jose. I was looking for a language that I could get behind that was functional, because I knew that what we were doing was broken, right? I caught the guy, Jose, in London. There was a conference called TechMesh. And I was a ridiculous fanboy. You know, I had Dave Thomas's book, and I've got this plan to give Dave Thomas's book to Jose to sign. Like, why would he sign it, you know? And so I said, could you sign? He said, Bruce, Tate, wait a minute. You know, and so he kind of brings out his book, and we kind of signed each other's books. And he said, 7 languages in 7 weeks. Remember a book that I didn't want to write, that I was afraid to write, that I thought was never going to be successful, but I thought that other people would want to walk through the same journey that I did, helped to inspire the Elixir programming language. And that's a really cool thing. So when you're nervous about the contributions that you can make, this is the ground floor. Put your ideas out there. It's really important that you do so, and the world can change when you do so. So Dave's book was called Programming Elixir, and when I was looking for a language to do what we were doing professionally, I found this thing called Elixir. It actually wasn't called Elixir at the time. It was called Lego at the time. And it was on the ERLANG virtual machine, and it was the ugliest language that I'd ever seen, and I ran away kicking and screaming, right? And I came back to it, and I said, wait a minute, this is radically different. It's changed. It's everything that I was looking for. It had all the ideas of, it had the beautiful approachability of the Ruby language and the syntax, and that's important to me. I'm dyslexic. I can't spell my way out of a paper bag. But when things are shaped the right way and in the way that I think, I'm much more productive. And it had this meta-programming thing, which was really important to me because we use a lot of domain-specific languages. And I think when you do use domain-specific languages, you actually think in terms of the problem that you're trying to solve. And it does more than save you a couple of keystrokes. It moves your headspace. And when you can move your headspace, great things can happen. And it also had this rock-hard, reliant, concurrent model, from ERLANG that I come to love for my relationship with Joe Armstrong, who strongly supported me when I wrote the 7 Languages book. So I wrote about it in 7 more languages, and really this was a blatant attempt to kind of get the snowball rolling for Elixir. And there was another language in there called Elm. These were kind of the 2 I wrote about. Other people on the team wrote about the other languages. But this started to get the snowball rolling, and people started to recognize, dang it, Dave Thomas has done it again, right? He's found this language that was in obscurity by a really nice guy who wasn't experienced enough to know about marketing yet. And what Dave was finding, this was the second programming language that he had written about in, I don't know, what, 10 or 15 years? And both of the languages were wallowing in obscurity till he wrote about them. And, you know, maybe it's just chance or fate, and maybe these things would have succeeded anyway. But it's interesting to me. And so I asked Dave why, what was his thought process when he discovered these languages? And he says, it's all about Quan. And if you look at it, it's undoubtedly true, right? I mean, from the beginning with pipelines. Pipelines save you a lot of characters, you know, that's good. But they also change the way that you think about programming. All of us who are moving from object-oriented languages to functional languages can say, I have a metaphor now, right? I know that functions are transformations. And when you crack open Phoenix, the pipelines are front and center, aren't they, right? There's even a feature called pipelines, right? Because this thing is transformed one step after another, right? And when you think about it, one of the fundamental strengths of Elixir is that it's got macros, and that's also one of the fundamental weaknesses. But when you have a macro language, that allows the development of Elixir in Elixir itself. It also opens the door to people like us who can build language-like features and experiment with them in the wild, and some of those features are eventually rolled into the language itself. And that's a powerful thing. And languages that do this are much more successful than languages that don't. It's a language of macros, right? It's also a language where all the things that you expect and need are there. It's a very young language with very good documentation. And how many times have you ever seen that? And it's actually more important than that. You can actually run code in the documentation, in the doc tests, and see that the features work the way that you expect them to. And you could actually access the documentation from all kinds of places within the Elixir ecosystem. And that's important. And it's a small thing, but it's a really big thing too, right? And if you look at the Elixir ecosystem that's on top of the ERLANG ecosystem, Elixir improves on some of the things that maybe ERLANG doesn't quite get right. How many of you have coded in some ERLANG? So a few of you. So if you are, I would bet that a good chunk of you were Emacs users. And the reason is that there is a Emacs plugin that creates an OTP template, right? I don't even know what the key combination is, but I used Emacs for a couple of weeks when I was learning OTP, right? You press this key combination, you get this giant template. Well, that giant template is embedded in an Elixir macro. That's a little different, right? And when you have that plugged in, then you can turn around and use it in a much more lightweight way. I'm coding in the domain instead of worrying about the whole interface of the OTP server. So all of you have your favorite features of Elixir, and you'll develop more over the course of this conference. But the Quan doesn't end with this list. There are all kinds of things. And I think that the most important piece of that is the people at the bottom. You represent the Quan in Elixir. So my daughter and I were able to go to the Empire State Building. It's a beautiful example of architecture. And you can sit back and you can be inspired and recognize that Quan goes two ways. Inspired people do inspiring things. But it's the leadership that really makes a big difference, isn't it? Because great leadership inspires great leadership, and that's how you get a great language. So I bet that you've been wondering why we call this Talk the Climb for a long time, and let me put you out of your misery a little bit. You know, I'm an extreme sports guy. I like to do wall climbing. Not that kind. I climb indoors, actually, with Kayla here. But I've always thought that there were a lot of programmers who were involved in climbing and other extreme sports. And I've often wondered why that's true. The guy on your left here is Sir Edmund Hillary, and this was the first successful summit attempt that we know of. There were another couple of expeditions that may have made the top, but the teams did not survive to tell the tale. But I want to submit to you the idea, the metaphor, that mountain climbing is seeking Quan and language making is seeking Quan. You can ask a mountain climber why they climb, and you very rarely get a straight answer. Do you guys remember what Mallory said when they said, why are you climbing Mount Everest? Because it's there, right? I don't know. It's a thing. It's quality without a name. I get something from it. And it also struck me that mountain climbing is hard. You know, Everest is especially hard at, you know, it's not the hardest mountain in the world, but it's a difficult one. That 8,000 meter mark at the top, that's important because over 8,000 meters, they call that place the death zone, where even if you're on oxygen, your body is slowly dying. The mountain is killing you. It's a little bit colder. You don't have the oxygen that you need. And under that kind of pressure, the brain does some crazy things, right? It swells up a little bit, accumulates fluid. And a lot of the a lot of the climbers that have died on Mount Everest that reach 8,000 meters, that's where most of the deaths occurred. I think, too, that language making is hard. When I spent some time with Jose in Poland this year, we were on a train ride, and I asked him, Jose, are you more productive with Elixir? How can I help to make you more productive? And he said, you know, I'm as productive as I need to be. I have great people around me. I have a great core team. I have great technology. I have a good understanding. It's a great time for that. But you know, let me flip that question on its head. Let me talk about when I'm not productive. Sometimes people get angry when they don't get what they want. And they behave in ways that are kind of hurtful to me. And when that happens, my productivity goes into the tank. And I think about that, and I think about the difficulty of climbing this mountain, and it kind of reminds me of the difficulty that climbers go through to reach the goal and the cost that that's kind of obvious in this this kind of enterprise. So it's sometimes messy. It's sometimes harder on the people who are closest to the problem than you expect it to be. So the second thing that I'll tell you today is be careful. This is an open source ecosystem, and it's one that you have a lot of say as you set the tone, as you set the feel for the language. So if this endeavor is so hard and so messy, how are we ever going to reach the top? Well, if you know anything about Everest, you know, well, that's easy. We just use SHERPAs, right? So SHERPAs are these people on the border between Tibet and Nepal. And they can do things, they can lift loads at those altitudes that we can't even lift at sea level. And almost all of the teams until the last 10 years or so have used SHERPAs to actually summit Mount Everest. So what does SHERPAs do? Well, this is a base camp. And base camps are very important for us. I want to talk about one base camp. For those of you who are building code on top of Elixir, you probably are keenly aware that you are building on top of somebody else's base camp, the ERLANG team, right? And so the ERLANG team established this model of concurrency. They established this beautiful core ecosystem that made us so very productive when it was time to layer features on top. In fact, I would argue that one of the most important decisions that Jose ever made was when he decided to embrace that base camp. On the left-hand side, you see this great big bundle of commits. That was part of the Lego language, right? This was a new ecosystem that didn't take advantage of the libraries of OTP, and the integration with ERLANG was difficult. And there was one last spike, just to the left of, just to the left of the really productive area on the right, where Jose said, "Oh man, this isn't going to work," and he calls that trough in the middle the valley of despair. And he said, "Oh, let me try one last thing to make this work," and it didn't work. And then he decided to embrace ERLANG, to embrace the base camp, to embrace the actor model and the concurrency, and not try to shape his own language, but make one that felt like and acted like ERLANG, but improved on those concepts. And you saw the spike that you see on the right-hand side, and we haven't looked back since. I love this picture, you know. "Oh, boss, I don't know if I can carry the whole kitchen. I think it's going to take two of us, you know. The iron chimney and the water basins on the one on the front, and the cast iron stove, the one in the back, and they're going up to Everest Base Camp, which none of us could do without a lot of preparation, right? So SHERPAs take the heaviest load, and that happens a lot. We see radical boost in productivity in communities that allow people to engage and carry a load. So there's a cool story. When our company decided that we were going to invest in Elixir, there wasn't a web server yet. There was this ugly abomination that Jose was building, as if he could build anything ugly, but yeah, he did. It's called Dynamo. Anybody actually use Dynamo? Couple of hands out there, right? Okay, George say, "Oh, why are you bagging on Dynamo?" It was pretty good, that Dynamo, but no, it was a dog. he says, "Bag away." But it was very clear that one man could not launch a language in a web server. And we weren't getting the type of adoption, the type of traction in Dynamo that would allow him to really get going. So what we did was we completely disengaged from Dynamo and said, "Hey, this can't happen. We don't know. We don't have a Sherpa. what we'll do is build a web server kit called Plug, and then see who shows up, right? So we built this web server kit called Plug, and a guy who is writing a book called Metaprogramming in Elixir, a guy named Chris McCord, found it and said, hey, this is cool. I'm going to write a web server, right? And a couple other people did too. This was the best one. And Jose saw it and said, oh man, that's Rails all over again. And Chris said, no, you misunderstand. This Rails stuff is just what you have to do to compete in the marketplace. What this is really about is channels. And look at this channel stuff. And now Jose and Chris are tight. And Chris is one of the greatest Sherpas in the ERLANG community, or in the Elixir community. Because Jose said, I can't do it myself. I need some Sherpas. And he asked the question in the right way. Sherpas also prepare the way. Sometimes there are difficult problems, like the integration between Phoenix and Elm, the language that's on the client side. That compiles to JavaScript. It's really cool. A lot of people in our community are interested in it. And we're starting to see a much tighter integration. And that's really important, but it's not something that the typical developer can do. So this is the Kimbu icefall, and that's one of the greatest obstacles on the pathway to Everest. And the way that it works is that you have a series of base camps, and you have to climb up to some to acclimate, and then climb down to recover, and then climb up a little and climb down. So maybe there are 4 base camps, so maybe you climb up and down 30 times, maybe there are 30 individual climb segments that you have to do on your way to the top. But the way it works on Everest is that every team sends some of their best Sherpas to prepare the way. They don't prepare the way for every individual team. They prepare the way for the whole season. And that's kind of what Chris and Evan have done with Elixir and Elm. So you might be wondering why I am using this really crass history of a people who have been exploited so that other people can climb Mount Everest. Mount Everest has mostly been summited on the backs of an oppressed people. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to say, jump on the back, let those Sherpas do the work. This is it. We're all Sherpas. You can write a book. You can give a talk. You can find a bug, and when you find a bug, you can put the answer where other people can find it. You can set the tone. You can be kind and humble. This is the ground floor, and we are all Sherpas. Because what you do is going to affect what they do. We can and we should share the load. Not because we have to, but because we're blessed. Thank you. So we have some time for some questions, and I bet that you've got some. And I hope that you have some, because I'm a little early. Yeah, there's a lot of meat out there. Don't be shy. I'm very patient. No? Yeah.
What would you say was your big Elixir? What was your big bond moment with Elixir?
So the question was, what was my big Quan moment with Elixir? And I'm going to answer that in 2 ways. So the first thing was that this was a long search, right? I was going to, Kayla remembers, I went to a lot of conferences in Europe because that's where the interesting conversations about language adoption were happening. There was a lot of Haskell development there. There were conferences that kind of spanned many different programming languages, which was much more attractive to me than a conference that already had the answer. So over the time, I dabbled in Scala and found that I loved what they did with the language in some ways, but in some ways, you almost got the worst of both worlds, right? You had the object-oriented and the functional type systems, and making those fit together in my head was a non-starter. And also, you were built on top of an impure foundation, right? So you could be completely right from your layer up, but somewhere down in the bowels of the system, somebody could be based on, I wanted a virtual machine that was pure all the way up, or pure enough. And so Scala wasn't it. I told you I'm a dyslexic, and so the parentheses and the prefix notation and closures and lists just blow me up. I mean, they completely explode my head. Haskell I loved, but it was a little bit too theoretical. And some of the most theoretical concepts, like the monads, are front and center. So they were difficult, not necessarily for me to consume, but for my team. Hard for me. So it was probably 2010 to 2012 when I was really looking for something, and but I knew I needed macros for DSLs. I knew I needed a beautiful syntax that thought like I did, and I knew I needed extra stability and speed, because if you're not going to get that, why move anyway, right? So we were very happy with our productivity. We would just throw more money at it. So the big Quan moment was when I saw the combination of those three things. I said, yeah, this is what I need. And as I was looking, I said, oh man, I'm going to launch this language the way Dave Thomas did. And then I found all his notes as he was writing his book. It says, I'm 2 months too late. Dang it, Dave. So he wrecked my Java career and my Ruby career, I guess you could say. But so yeah, the two moments were that moment, and also I had to tell my boss, hey, we're going to move to Elixir. He said, okay, great. What web server? I said, doesn't exist yet. We have to launch it. He says, okay, so wait a minute. You're going to help launch a language and a web server. I said, yep. He said, I'm in. Yeah. More questions? Yes, it's going to be harder, it's going to take longer, but the payoff is going to be bigger than you think. So the question was, I wrote about the transition from Java to Ruby, which was object-oriented language to object-oriented language, and the big things there were the languages themselves and the type model. With the transition to Elixir, it's much different. So the syntax is relatively similar, but you're going from object-oriented to functional. You're also going to, so it's language to functional programming and to concurrent programming and distributed programming all at the same time. And that's a very, very big problem to solve, but the payoffs. So to give you an idea, we're running probably, because of where we are in our migration for my platform, we have about 4 times as much Ruby code running as Elixir code, and we have 28 times the processing power. We're on the smallest dyno possible in Elixir. We only have one of them, and we're using about 1/10 of the power of that. And Ruby, we are maxing 2 of the greatest, which are each 14 more times powerful than the counterparts. So I would say, you guys, we're several hundred times. So it's harder and the payoff is bigger than you're going to expect. And when you start to attract engineers, you'll get the best. And as you transition the people, your own people, you'll really, you'll help them make a huge step in their evolution as people and programmers. Okay, thank you so much for the interaction. It's been a pleasure talking with you.